Well, welcome.
Hello.
It's wonderful that you can be here for this very special event. We are engaged in the doctoral dissertation for Adeeb Yousif. The title of the dissertation is Fragmentation of Identity Group and Conflict Mitigation in Darfur-Sudan, 2005 to 2015. I'm Daniel Rothbart, and I'm very happy to join my colleague here, Solon Simmons, who did so much work in the preparation of this event. And I want to give special commendation and great appreciation to Professor John Paden, who has been over the years a very generous contributor to the academic life of this institution. And now, even as emeritus professor, he continues to keep saying yes. We keep asking him again and again, I'm somewhat embarrassing, can you please do this? And he just keeps agreeing.
So that he would finally resolve all conflicts.
Yeah, exactly. Well, then,
that's a goal.
We have a conflict of interest in that, obviously, to do that. So, so thank you so much for your major contribution that continues. This is a very pleasurable moment for me. I've been working with Adeeb for a few years and recognized that he came to SCAR as a major contributor to peace building in Sudan. He's devoted his life to the cause. He's intimately connected to some of the leading figures in peace building, and he is just such an impressive person. Just officially, he is president and founder of World Peace and Reconciliation, a nonprofit organization devoted to peace education. In 2001, he co-founded Sudan Social Development Organization, which is a human rights and development NGO. He's been involved in so many of the activities in Sudan. And then bringing that to SCAR, to ICAR, now SCAR, as contributing to the life of this institution. And it's been a pleasure to work with Sudan, and we have the same personal tension that maybe you'll be going, but not leaving our family. Following our usual procedure, I've asked Adeeb to give a summary of his dissertation, and then we'll follow through with that.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you everybody for making your time to come this morning. This is very special day for me, and I believe it's going to rank as one of the most important days for the past 40 years, or the past 4 decades. To reach the point, I passed through different circumstances. I also passed through different challenges and so on. I received a lot of support from different people, scholarly support and non-scholarly support. And with that, let me start by expressing my profound gratitude to the chair of my dissertation, Dr. Dan Rothbart, for his advice through our dissertation. Also, I'd like to thank Dr. Solon for his advice, and being a student with him, it contributed a lot to my journey. And indeed, Dr. John, for his advice. I remember a time I went to talk to him about part of my dissertation, and by then I was trying to do something on crime and corruption. And the question was, is it visible? And I didn't get the meaning of is it visible. And I was trying to argue about it. And so, yeah, and, so thank you so much for that. But also, my distinguished professors throughout the classwork that I attend, whether it is here in class or outside class, they contributed a lot to my journey. In the second semester, when I took a class with Professor Sandy, I came to realize that the school for me, it is not just a place where I can pursue a degree. It was a reflection class, and I came to understand that it is more than academic. It became like a place for healing. And there's a lot of things that I managed to reflect upon my journey coming from Sudan, having witnessed part of the atrocities there. So the school, it became more than academic institution for me. I can simply look at it as a healing place, but also it became like a networking area where I met like a lot of people and many individuals and institutions throughout the years that I spent here. I'd like also to thank the SCAR administration for their work and their collaboration throughout my journey here in school, and the questions that I came to ask them, like Paul, for his advice on issues. As an international student, I faces a lot of challenges here. So I really thank the administration in general for all their support throughout the time that I've been here. And indeed, my colleague and classmate, that we managed to have classes together, to argue together, to develop like some of the ideas together. Outside the school, I receive a lot of support. And as somebody coming from Sudan or coming from Africa, I've never thought about something on the issue of integration more than being connected to care and Bill. That gave me like a different feeling of being here as somebody from Sudan. And the least feeling that I can describe is a family. I've never looked at them as less than a parent. I remember I went to school in Fairfax and they asked me to give a speech about refugees. And by then I was living with them. So I never thought myself as a refugee. I said I'm a guest. And yeah, and all my speech was central upon that, that I'm a guest. So thank you so much for your support. I also received like a lot of different support from people here in the area, from the Sudanese community, from non-Sudanese community here. And thank you, Miranda, thank you, Jackie, for coming here, and thank you everybody for coming here. So what I have in mind to share with you on the today, I prepared this presentation out of 7 interrelated points. So I'll start talking about a bit about introduction, and many of you, they know a lot of the issues in Sudan and in Darfur, and so I'll talk briefly about it. Next, I will talk about the problem statement. Then I will look at the research question, and then I will talk a bit about the methodology and the data collection, how I managed to collect my data. And then I will spend a bit of time on literature review. And then I will talk a bit about the presentation of this data. And finally, I will talk about the finding and conclusion and recommendation. So that's what I have in mind to share with you. As introduction, I did my research in Sudan, and in particular in in Darfur. So the area in kind of green is Darfur region, and it is a part of Sudan. It is one of the Sudanese region. It borders 4 countries, Libya, Chad, Central Africa, and South Sudan. There's a lot of things, problems going in the other part of Sudan, especially the south, a conflict that started before independence and ended in 2005. So I look at Darfur before the conflict, how life in Darfur before the conflict. And to be honest, if I'm to tell children of 17 years old or children of 10 years old about my childhood, I don't think they believe what I'm talking about. They may think that I'm talking about a different country, or maybe I am dreaming, because the actual reality before it is different than the things today. So I look at the Darfur as a place where it used to supply most of the Sudanese market. It was also this Darfurian that they have doing trade, not only in Darfur but also in different Sudanese market. I looked at the collaboration between the ethnic group in Darfur, and it was fantastic relationship between the farmers and the herders and the ethnic group in general. And then I look at the isolated conflict and how it used to be resolved by traditional leaders, or locally we call them native administration. But the area itself, the current conflict, when I look at it, there's a lot of people, they describe the conflict in Darfur from a different perspective. So scholars like Julie Fleet, she look at this conflict as an ethnic conflict, and mainly between the African and non-African. Somebody like Mahmadani, he look at it as a conflict as a result of the environmental degradation or scarcity. So people, they look at it as a conflict over land. Others, they look at it as a political conflict. And throughout the courses that I've taken here, there's no single reason for conflict. So there's conflict lies upon different layers, and there's more than one reason that conflict can occur. The consequence of the Darfur conflict, there's the statistic, there's no accurate statistic, but this is part of the estimation of what happened. About 500 people were killed, another 5,000 wounded, estimated about 3.5 internal displaced people, 1.5 refugees and people living in diaspora, and then about 5,000 villages had been burned. As I said, there's a lot of debate about the numbers, and especially when it comes to the human casualties. So NGOs, they are talking about 400 people. The State Department talked about 90,000. The United Nations talked about 300,000, and the Sudanese government talked about 9,000. But the actual reality, there's people that have been killed in that conflict. In a situation such as this, international community has to respond. So from the early beginnings, there's NGOs that have been helping the internal displaced people, not only by their basic needs, but also on issues of human rights abuses. And then the second, the United Nations also got involved, and they released about 17 UN Security Council resolution. Many people talking about the implementation of this resolution, and they think that is unfulfilled. The White House called the situation in Darfur as a genocide. The African Union took a lead in 2004 to 2006 on the issue of peace, and then they signed the peace agreement in Abuja 2006, and before they deploy African Union peacekeepers in 2004. In 2005, the ICC get involved in the Darfur case, and then there used to be a big movement here in the United States known as Darfur, Save Darfur. It is one of the biggest movement in working for Darfur, but not only here in the US, but in North America, and then they have like some organizations in Europe. They help in creating Darfur Consortium. That is in Africa is about 27 African organizations working on the issue of Darfur. The problem statement, what the problem that I'm looking at the phenomena of the fragmentation of the rebel groups in Darfur. And I look at the time when the conflict started in 2003. There are early two rebel group. By now there is more than 77 rebel group, and the government have signed about 43 peace agreement. None of this agreement is fully implemented, and the security situation in Darfur is remain worse. Beside the fact the IDPs remain at their camps, and so there's no change basically on in the situation in Darfur, regardless of this 43 agreements. The significant so this is the two categories of the rebel group. This is the rebel groups that they are fighting, and there are about 24 rebel group, and then there is about and the rest are those who have signed peace agreement. So I put them in the shape of the Darfur map. There's some kind of varieties among the rebel groups. So when I look at the issue of their political demand, there is some group that they look for regime change, some group looking for political accommodation, others they are uncertain. You don't know what they are looking for. They are between this and that. When it comes to the state, some of them they look at secular state with clear separation of religion from policy. Others they are looking for Islamic kind of state, and others they are looking for civil state. Their current situation, some of the rebels are fighting the government, others are signing agreements, and maybe somebody can think about why I categorize them still as rebel when they sign agreement, because they never change anything. They never even change their name. They never form as a political party, and they categorize themselves as rebel to the time I'm speaking. So that's why I put them as signatories to agreement. And then others that are uncertain, they're living in the diaspora, and you don't know if they are fighting or if they are trying to do something different. When it comes to how they look at the situation in Darfur, some of them they are looking for secession. They want Darfur to be an independent state. Others they would look for unity, and so with this kind of complication, I came to think about the definition of the rebel groups. There's different kind of definition for rebel group. Some scholars define as a non-government group of people formally organized and having announced a name for their group. So that could be a rebel group. I also look at the issue of fragmentation, and some scholars they look at the fragmentation and define it as a process where a faction of a rebel exit a group formally, and then they can either form a new group or join an existing group or join the government. So next I would like to say to look at how I organized, how I managed, what is the question that I asked myself in order to gather this information. So I thought about one question, and how the question is how insurgency fragmentation based on ethnic affiliation or situational identity further increase the risk of violence in the region and jeopardize conflict mitigation in Darfur. And in order to answer this question, I had 3 follow-up questions. The first question is, what is the main causes for this conflict? And then the follow-up question was, what the rebel is fighting for? And then the last question is the challenges that imposed by the fragmentation. The purpose of this study, I want to understand the fragmentation of identity in Darfur, but basically there's 3 other specific objectives that have been looked for, and that to examine the fragmentation of the armed group in Darfur, and to assess the challenges that posed by these fragmentations. The significance of this research, I think it is a research of its first kind in Sudan, looking at a specific area of the conflict. And so this research has generated kind of knowledge that can be used by researchers or practitioners. So this in the sense of academic purposes. It could also be used by policy or policy makers, and it could also be used by practitioners. The third part of this, I would like to share with you how I managed to collect my data, and it is basically the traditional way of collecting data. So the research, I carry out this research in 3 countries, in South Sudan, in Uganda, and then in Sudan remotely. And that's because I can't travel to Sudan by then due to the sanctions from the United States on Sudan. So I managed to do the interview, and then I interviewed about 87 male between the age of 87% of my interview are male. The age between 23 and 65. None of these people that they claim that they are sick or so. The data gathering, it is basically the traditional way of gathering data. So I did like interviews, and I did focus group, and one of the greatest things that I really enjoy is the focus group. And whenever I have a focus group, it gives me hope that things can change soon, especially at the beginning. So when different groups come together, they start talking about the past. In fact, the way of the greeting itself, it's something different. You don't feel differences between this group. And it gave me a sense that also they disagree on something that they really agree upon. They talk the same language, and so. But at some point they reach into a point that no, when they came to distinguish themselves, us and them, and so. But at the end, one of the things that I really enjoy doing it in the data collection is the interviews. I mean the focus group. So what I did about 11 interviews in South Sudan, and then 21 interviews with rebel leaders in Uganda, 14 with rebel leaders in Darfur, and this by cell phone, And then I did 23 interviews with the rebels that have already signed agreement, also by interviews, by cell phone or Skype. And I did 6 interviews with displaced communities that include IDPs, internal displaced people, and refugees. And those have participated on the peace agreement, in particular Doha Peace Agreement. And then finally, I interview about 5 organizations, the Sudanese organization based in Uganda. The data analysis, I mainly depend on the content analysis, and then I also use narrative. And I develop 4 thematic areas, and then I have like sub-thematic areas that help me to analyze the data. Part of the theories that help me to see what is happening, I use social identity theory, and I also use relative deprivation theory, but I also use other component of other theory in the field, especially political elite and so. The limitation of this research, the data on this particular topic is not much. So I suffer to get like so many data about the rebel fragmentation, especially in the case of Sudan. Then the IRP, that I can't travel to Sudan. So it is one of the things that also I look at it as part of the limitation of that. And the last thing, part of the participant, they have like kind of tension to speak frankly about this. And then I have like to use follow-up questions. I have to use different methods in order to make them speak. The third part of this, I mean the first part of the presentation, I look at the literature review. And the literature review, I looked at Sudan, and in particular South Sudan, the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, and then I look at the SPLM, SPLA back when they are fighting, and the fragmentation that started in 1991. And I hold the view that the current conflict in South Sudan is dated back to that fragmentation. It happened between Dinka, Nuer, and Shuluk. And that's Riek Machar from the Nuer, and Garang from Dinka, and Lamakol from Shuluk. So I look at that. I also looked at the situation in Libya, and then I look at the situation in Syria. I look at the situation in Eritrea, and then in Liberia. So that's the area that I managed to get some of my literature review. And there's different causes, internal causes and external causes for different rebel group. My data analysis, so I look at the government strategy, and one of the things that I look at is the policy of the government, and divide and rule, how the government managed to divide the rebel group, and it is one of the politics that, or the policies that authoritarian governments use in order to make their opponent weaker. So the government analyzed the divide and rule, how they managed to divide the rebel group. Then I look at the tribal counter-insurgency, and that is the Janjaweed. And in Darfur, in general, there is no tribe called Janjaweed, and there's no ethnic group that called Janjaweed. But there's a group that formed by the government, and it's known as Janjaweed. And when I was looking at the social identity theory, this really helped me how the government managed to put this together in order to distinguish between the African and non-African, and then they create this situation where Arab are fighting non-Arab. So I look at that, and the counter insurgency policy is not something new. It is something it had been used in different countries, including the United States. And then I look at the Felt manual of the U.S. And there, the counterinsurgency policy is a group of people that they organized by the military, and their main purpose is to inform and to provide some information for the military, and that's from the local community, and for one reason or two reasons. Maybe they know the culture, they know the terrains, and they know the language. So that's the counterinsurgency. But in Sudan, the issue is different. The issue in Sudan, the government organized a group of people to fight another ethnic group. That's why I call it tribal counter insurgency. I look at the geopolitics, and from 2005, where the rebel used to live, where the rebel getting their support, and then after. So I look at the relationship between Sudan and Chad, how it used to be, and then how it is today, and how that contributed to the rebel. And different stories coming out of that. The rebels, they used to live in Chad, and well, they get support from Chad, and then Chadian government, they change, and then there's kind of proxy war between the two countries, and then they normalize the situation between the two countries. And so then I look at the Sudanese Eritrea relationship, and it's not different than what I described about Chad. I look at the only difference is that in 2006, Eritrean government helped the Sudanese government in order to sign an agreement with the Eastern Front. And since then, the relationship between Sudan and Eritrea became fine. And in all the countries that bordering Sudan, they have an agreement. And the only agreement that they sign is security arrangement. I also look at the Libyan-Sudanese relationship, especially after Gaddafi, and I also look at the same relationship during Gaddafi's era. I look at the situation, the relationship between Egypt and Sudan, especially after Mubarak, how the Sudanese government managed to normalize the relationship, and so. Yeah, so those are the geopolitics. Then I look at the political accommodation, and the political accommodation, one of the tactics that the government has used is to sign agreement. And as I said, between 2006 and 2014, there's 43 different agreements that have been signed. And this is only in Darfur, but there's other conflict in Sudan, so the government keep using political accommodation as a tactic in order to accommodate the rebel together. And all this agreement has contributed to the fragmentation of the rebel group. The second thing the fact that whenever there is an agreement or peace negotiation, there is more split on the year, on that particular year. And some of the rebel groups, they don't call it peace talk. In fact, they refer it as peace joke. So, yeah, so looking at this, 2006 was the highest fragmentation, and then 2011. 2011 is the Doha process that was, then they signed an agreement in 2006, the DPA, the Darfur Peace Agreement. So it created that kind of movement by ethnic groups. So I look at the four as ethnic group. I look at Zagawa, I look at Masalit, and then Arab, Midob, Berti. So those are the fragmentation that occur during and after the peace agreement. The second, I look at the factors that contribute to this fragmentation, and I looked at the vision of the rebel group, what kind of vision they are fighting for, and so. and there's no clear vision that they are fighting for. I look at the personal gain and personal interest. I've looked at the issue of foreign support, and Julie Fleet, she was articulating how the foreign support helped in dividing the movement at the early beginning in 2004, and she pointed out several foreign support from South Sudan, from Libya, and so on, how that helped in dividing the rebel group. I also looked at the issue of technology and social media, and now it became more easier for the rebel group to use internet, to use WhatsApp, to use different social media in order to demonstrate and announce their existence. And for a reason I don't understand, mediators, they depend also on those sites, and they invite rebel groups according to what they posted out there. I look at the negative ethnicity, and with that the theory from John Galton helped me to see the contradiction and the attitude and behavior of the rebel group toward one another. So on the issue of perception, of the issue of how they look to the other ethnic group, and on the issue of their behavior toward the other group, either killing them or either looking down at them, and so on. That is part of why the rebel groups are fighting. They claim that they're fighting against injustice, and so so that theory helped me to analyze the negative ethnicity. Finally, I will look at the finding. So when I talk about fragmentation, I never mean division, because division at some point, and especially in conflict resolution, might be looked at as a solution. If two groups, they they dispute on something, sometimes part of the solution might be dividing this group into two, or yeah. And when I look at one of the demands in Israel, for instance, is like two states. In Sudan, when the dispute reaches the point that the only solution is the two countries, so they divide the country into two. So I mean by fragmentation, the split. And so when part of the finding, I look at the community and the destruction on the community, so that the community has been destroyed. It creates culture of revenge and retaliation. It also adds new tragedies to that deepen the conflict. It also helps in proliferation of the small arm and open borders. The part of the finding is the rebel fragmentation extend the duration of the war. If the DPA was well implemented, and so by 2006 this war was over, but since then the rebel keep fragmented, and so it extend the duration of the war. It changed the dynamics. The conflict today is not like the conflict when it started, on the issue of demand, of the issues, and so. And the model from Chris Mitchell, it really helped me to see the changing of the dynamic of the conflict. It also harmed the peace agreement. So, as I said earlier, the government used the peace agreement as a tactics. Like whomever is there, they invite them to come, they sign agreement, they kept them in Khartoum, they never see the region, and that's how it harmed the peace agreement and create new organization. But also sometimes it's difficult to achieve peace with so many divided groups. It creates like really misunderstanding and mistrust between the Darfurian community ethnic group. The rebel are Darfurian, they have families there, so this creates like kind of mistrust between those who sign agreement, those who are not signing agreement, and so. It also, as I said at some point, 43 different agreements. Abil from South Sudan, he wrote a book called Sudan, Too Many Agreements Dishonored. And so I don't know if he is to revise, because his book was earlier, it's like in early 2000. I don't know if he's tried this to revise his book, what his title could be. And the part of the thing that also the rebel group, the fragmentation, help in I mean, here is like, in order to understand the rebel fragmentation, there is a fundamental need of understanding the formation of this group, how it formed, and so, and also the social identity group. It helped me here in looking at the rules, the regulations, the pain of exclusion, the inclusion, and so. So it is important to understand how this group was founded. And lastly, the finding is that it increased the suffering of the civilian, and mainly the IDPs. The part of this, because it creates kind of donor fatigues. When I was working in Darfur, I worked in a project, and the budget was $50 million. Today, none of those organizations exist, let alone any of the implementation of any activities. So there's kind of donor fatigue, and it creates complexity between traveling and delivering humanitarian aid, and so. I provide like 5 recommendations. I look at peace education and alternative to violence. I also see structural awareness and functional coexistence. I also recommend that there is a fundamental need for ground representation and examining actors' legitimacy. I also recommend that there is need, or fundamental need, for inclusion of women group at all levels of the peace process. And finally, I recommend that peace process need to be civilized. And by civilizing it is increasing the role of civil society on that. And when I look at the IDP camps, maybe about 65% of the population are women, and they have been paying the biggest price on this conflict. They have suffered a lot, and I don't think they address their issues on negotiation. So I believe that there is a fundamental need for inclusion of women at all levels of the peace process. And the final thing, one of the practical things that I've done with peace education and alternative to violence, I've trained a group of rebel group that signed the agreement, and they left to Khartoum on issues of peace building and alternative to violence. And I'm still in contact with them, and they have been asking for more training and more capacity building project there. So this is what I have in mind to share with you, and thank you so much for your attention. Before I conclude, I would like to give a special thanks for my friend Jan de Bie, who came from Holland for the sake of this for the event. So Jan, thank you so much for coming, and the entire Sudanese community. I know they travel from a lot, from far from Philadelphia, and so thank you so much. And that's what I have.
Well, thank you.
Just sit or you stand?
You want to?
Oh yeah.
You want to stand? Okay, so we will now discuss the work with Professor Paden first.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you, Adeeb, for really an extraordinary insight, an insider's insight into this very important case study. It's a case study of genocide, as we know, as well, at least from the outside perspective. I thought, reading the depth that you bring to it, I thought I would get the simple version from Google. So I went to War in Darfur. I recommend it. It's 40 pages, almost half the length of this, and it goes year by year by year, 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it also reminded me a timeline. Your challenge is going to be to clarify this for probably outside readers as well. So some kind of a time graph there, I think, was important. The central question of this, to an outsider, it is just astonishing. You say from 2005 to 2015, you go from 2 groups to 77 groups. That boggles the imagination, and we want to know, we want to know what's going on here. And it may not be the end of the process either, and you walk us through a number of those elements. But this is a war zone. This has been a war zone throughout that entire period. And the thing that I think, if you were, the walls of gravity.
It's the word.
If you were to take this to the next level, just to put it in some kind of publishable form, you want to know what the dynamics are that are causing this fragmentation. You want it in kind of a clear kind of fashion. But it's also quite clear to an outside reader that the government of Sudan is doing a masterful job of divide and conquer. And so there's a kind of a missing something there by just looking at the rebels. I mean, you bring in the government as needed, but the fact is, Bashir has just been playing this like a puppet master. How does he get away with that? We know that if it's just the ethno part of it, ethno-kinship, ethno-religious, ethno-linguistic, there are any number of permutations and things, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and just some very basic kinds of concepts there. But how does it happen that these fragmentations, just in your own words now, Mark, from this, how do you think this fragmentation has been orchestrated or organically derived? And to what extent do these ethno factors come in? And I don't just mean Arab Africa. I mean, there are over 85, anthropologists would say more than 85 ethnic groups in Darfur. So we're not maybe at the end there, but we all know that through marriage alliances, through combinations of things, why these 77 more imposed? Why did they allow this to happen? Why can't they get coalitions together? And what is the strategy of the government if, in fact, they want Darfur to remain part of the government? There must be some voices in there who are thinking, this genocide is not going to produce results. So your basic question of fragmentation, can you tell us why it's happening at such a speed, 10 years here, and whether this is being ethnically orchestrated or there's some other factors involved? And I want to get to the religious factor as well. I'm putting you on the spot to kind of summarize and clarify how this extraordinary case study, fragmentation, which is not a natural development. Someone is orchestrating it, or there's some organic dynamic there. How would you if you were explaining it to your kindergarten group when you make your next visit.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for the question. I think there's a few things here before. While I was divining this, I look at the this proverb that you said, the enemy of my enemy. Yeah, and so I look at this, and at some point, Netanyahu was invited to come to speak here at the Congress, and he tried to change this. He said, "The enemy of my enemy is my enemy," and he was referring this to Iran. And so, in the case of Darfur, there's some group, they have ethnic tension, but the ethnicity is not the only issue, because within one ethnic group, you get like more than, for instance, within the four as ethnic groups, there's about 17 rebel factions. Yeah, so at some point, four as ethnic groups, they don't have clan. So they need like an identity to tie the group. So sometimes it goes to direction like North Darfur or South Darfur, or people from the mountain, people from the flat. Yeah, so they need like kind of identity to location. Yeah, that's also applied to the Arab group. So it is not only that the Arab as one identity group, and so there's also about 9 ethnic, factions there. The main or the driving point here I can see is the government, that they managed to get people inside this group and then to give some information and so. So the mastermind for the fragmentation is the government, and the government has been using this for so long. It is not like the first region that they use it in Darfur. This tactic has been used in South Sudan, and they brought Lamakol, Mashar, and they signed agreement and so and so. So the mastermind on this, the government, but unfortunately the rebel, they accept this, and they.
So conflict mitigation will mean focusing less on the rebels and more on this strategy of divide and rule from the if you were to do a sequence.
Yeah. So so I think it needs both. It needs the strategy, and it needs also for the mediators to evaluate what went wrong. And especially the mediator that they are working on the issue of the agreement. They don't need to sign a new agreement. There is a fundamental need for evaluation for those agreements that have been signed, and then from there they can start. Knowing that, as I pointed at some point, the government used this as a tactic.
The lesson of the last 10 years is that things that are signed don't really represent any progress. So there needs to be a kind of a stepping back and well, what is the peace? What is the conflict mitigation process going to be given this fragmentation that you described in such detail?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that the fundamental need for evaluation, evaluation for this peace agreement before they design a new agreement. Second, there is a need also for capacity building for the rebel group, and that's what I was talking about, functional coexistence and structural awareness. There's some organizations that have tried to build the rebel capacity on the issue of negotiation and so, but it's not the reason. They need more than that. They need a comprehensive way of addressing this, the reason for fighting, other case studies, and so.
Yeah. Well, it's a 10-year slice of time on a war zone, and we're all looking for what comes next. The question that you raise in the dissertation about political religion comes in here as well, because if you're looking for things that could bring cohesion religion and could either divide or bring things together. In the case of Sudan, I wonder if you could just remind us of what you see as the spectrum. I'm curious that you didn't start in 1999 with the ouster of Solon and there's a pendulum swing. In fact, what would be very interesting if you were to do this as a book, to do a timeline of what's going on at the government level here as well, because there are ups and downs, particularly on this religious side of things. How would you characterize the spectrum from Sufism to traditional views of Islam to this hardline,
Yeah, I think the central point here is political Islam and how it has been used in order to divide people. And therefore,
top down, that political Islam is, I mean, the Turabi thing is the Islamic Front is not what's going on at the grassroots level. So how does it get into Darfur? Just through key positions?
Yeah, so and therefore it gets through different ways. One of them is the Darfurian intellectual.
Yeah.
So that we are a member of the National Islamic Front. This is far before 1989.
Before your time, but you're living in the shadow of it here in your time period.
Yeah, and then also the starvation that took place like in the 80s, in 1985, and how the National Islamic Front, they managed to provide some kind of assistance and relief for the...
So that's one factor, this hard line coming from the center down. And what about the traditional forms of Islam? The Ummah party and the Sufis and the just ordinary people. You've characterized it, I think, very nicely in just an individual relationship to God.
Yeah, but the Ummah party and then the other Islamic parties, they never became a solution in the Darfur conflict.
Yeah.
And many Darfurian, they look at this, they call them traditional political parties. And it create kind of tension between those who used to have been part of these traditional parties and they joined the government. I mean, they joined the rebel. And many of them, either they exit them or they have like kind of tension.
There's just a big subject that you're getting us into now, and I don't want to distract you, but that really should be in your published version here. How you handle this spectrum of religion rather than just the hard line, and particularly since the hard line is the top-down stuff, which may or may not make it all the way over to Darfur. On the ethnic side, you've just given us some numbers, including in there 31% for 31%, Zagawa, whatever. How do you handle the definitions of ethnicity or ethno-linguistic identities here? If you were to, because you also mentioned situational identity, which means that any combination of those things could happen depending on circumstances or depending on if you're talking about some cultures, how they marry out rather than marry in, and hence create coalitions and so forth. But what's your sense, having kind of been very close to it, of all of these numbers we're seeing about ethnic groups A, B, and C, and now you're saying, okay, there are locational qualifications, and are those things written in stone, or are those things that can be managed and manipulated both for cohesion and for fragmentation?
Yeah, it could be managed by cohesion, and as I said at some point when I was talking about the focus group, the group that when they came, how they greet one another, how they can share their past, whether when they were in the field and so. One second, there's no group that having a name of an ethnic group like this group was titled to a specific ethnic group. Now, but there is a group that having like SLA unity or SLE. Yeah, so there's a different kind of names, but this is not upon ethnic group.
Political terms rather than, let's say, anthropological terms, because I think in anthropology today, it's much more fluidity in how you change identities and depending on.
Yeah, and I think
Just curiously, how would you define an Arab in Sudan?
I think this is very difficult to define Arab in Sudan because they look alike.
Yeah.
And
we have Shia Arabs. We have Shia Arabs in Nigeria that look like other Nigerians too.
yeah,
So there's something else going on here.
it's very difficult to define them from the physical appearance.
Exactly,
You can
yeah.
find somebody who claims to be an Arab and he's darker than me. And you can find somebody who is lighter and he's not an Arab. You can find somebody who speaks Arabic better than.
So what's the key?
Huh?
How would you, if you were trying to explain to a sixth grader, what's an Arab?
I don't think there is a need to categorize the conflict in Darfur as a conflict.
I'm not characterizing. What I'm fishing for is most scholars regard Arabs as people who speak Arabic as their first language. Nothing to do with skin color, nothing to do with culture. They can be Christian, they can be Muslim, they can be nothing. But it's a linguistic category. At least that's the standard. And maybe in Darfur there's a different kind of take on this, but that would be the benchmark that people would normally say it's a language thing rather than a cultural thing or a religious thing.
Yeah, I cannot disagree with you on the issue of language, that an Arab is those who are, can speak Arabic and claim to be Arab.
Yeah, it's a self-identity. I'm taking too much time here, and we can continue some of this because we're really talking about the next level. The outside factors here are really important. The international community, the African Union, which wants to keep countries together. South Sudan was a big exception to that. And some of these things are the context within which you're going to be having to wrestle with peace in Darfur. Whether you're going, well, let me just ask you, what's your vision of a settlement in Darfur? Are we talking federalism? Are we talking secession? Are we talking something else to integrate it back into Sudan? Where would you kind of see the?
Yeah, I think the best way for Darfur is federalism. Darfur is two kinds of Darfur: the political Darfur, in a sense of geographical area, but there's also the social part of Darfur. Darfurians who are living in the other part of Sudan. Sometimes there's no specific census, but people, they claim that Darfurians who are living in the other part of, in different part of Sudan are more than Darfurians who are living in Darfur. And with the experience of South Sudan seceding from Sudan, it created a real problem of identity problem here. Nasruddin, he wrote an article about this. And I think there's no way for secession of Darfur. Three, it's very difficult to convince all Darfurians for the separation. It is not the case in South Sudan. The case in South Sudan, people, they voted 99% for separation. In Darfur, that's not going to happen. So the best way for the situation in Darfur is.
Well, we can continue this in some other venue, but this question of is there any light at the end of the tunnel here is really important. And if it's federalism, maybe that should be in your conclusion in some way. And just wrestle with that idea. We can talk more about the kinship issues and how that creates situational ethnicities on some other occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Simmons. Thank you so
so much for your presentation. It's a very great experience, and nice to see you arrive at this day and with so much data and having done so much work on this. One of the things that I wanted to shift to is a methodological question about how it is you came to learn what you learned. Because one of the it stands out in one of the slides you have, and maybe not enough in the dissertation, is these leader interviews that you've done. One of the, a value add. You always have to ask, what is the unique contribution you're making? And I think that you have one, contact with and information from people who are very hard to first identify and then to work with. So that's something to be aware of. That's a real value add to the dissertation. So what is it, could you reflect on some moments in those interviews when you really felt like you understood where you were going, that you could answer the question of the hypothesis about fragmentation? Were there critical moments in those interviews that stand out to you today that you would want to share?
Yeah, I think there's many of them. Among them is that the recognition. Many of the interviewees, they recognize that they start, sometimes this is what they say, that they start running before they walk. And that they didn't have like a clear political idea together. Second, the lack of international diplomatic relation. The issue of the group to recognize that they have lack of this, I think there's a positive point where they can build upon, and they can rewrite what they are fighting for, why they are fighting for, and they might have a strong vision that can unite the group together. Second, I think also the reflection on their experience and how this have taken them from 2006 to the present time. They don't have an experience to point it before, but now they can talk about this. One of the interviewees, he used to work for the African Union as an observer, and so he gave me some of the area of their control from 2004 to 2008, and now where they are living. In fact, I met him in Juba. So the fact that they used to have a strong area of control and now they live in exile, that's something also positive that they can point it upon themselves.
Because I want to emphasize that, and it appears in the dissertation already, but again, moving towards something like a publication, I think that's where the real, much of the interest would be, is in your capacity to draw on the actual voices of those who are engaged in the conflict, especially these are rebel leaders, and how they came to self-recognition. Also points to some of like your alternatives to violence opportunities that maybe through discussion groups and through maybe use of point of view or a place like that there's a capacity to come to self-awareness and to develop a political vision. It's just something that stands out to me. It's in the dissertation, but perhaps could even be exploited more. I wanted to pick up on one of John's points about the solution, because the dissertation is framed as a criticism of the problem, that is, of factions and divisions and fragmentation. And I think you may be onto something very fundamental here. Your allusions to other conflicts like Syria, Liberia, Libya, that this is happening in many places, maybe Yemen. These are issues that are emerging. And it sounds like that certain authoritarian leaders in the region are happy to exploit these circumstances. But I think that I wanted to build on how this is a very general problem. And just, as I was reading it, I went back to, this is my own political tradition, but Alexander Hamilton and his letter on November 21st, 1787, and it's now known as Federalist Number 9. Just to give a sense of how fundamental this problem is, he says, the alternative, we're stuck with either the alternative of either taking refuge at once in the arms of monarchy or of splitting into an infinity of little, jealous, clashing, tumultuous commonwealths, the wretched nurseries of unceasing discord. Right? And that seems to me to be what we're seeing in large parts of this region and beyond into the west of Africa too. that there are these opportunities, that there's something fundamental. Maybe the problem is not what causes fragmentation, but what causes unity. You know, that how do you create unity when maybe the natural tendency of human beings is to latch upon one issue or another issue and to grab and to formulate these things in incommensurable ways with one another. And it sounds to me like you and your work and in your vision for peacemaking have some idea about how you might move toward producing unity. So maybe that's the next phase of the project, I suggest. And so let me turn it to a question. How would you propose to bring about rebel unity in the context of this state repression and human rights violations? Are there ways in which you might turn your attention to promoting unity?
Yeah, great. I think that's a great question. But in fact, I really love your questions. And I remember once here you asked a question about what is after Trump. And it drew my attention. I went home to think about it, and it was part of my dissertation. I put it there, what is after Bashir, or therefore after Bashir. And I look at a lot of things after Bashir. Now they have the rebel have a common enemy, Bashir, but what is after? So I really love your question. And on this question about unity, I think there is about 13 unity process that has been tried between 2007 to 2012. But none of this process lasts for 1 year. So and then looking at that, there's a fundamental thing that went wrong. That's why there's a collision for less than 1 year, and then it break away. I think the issue of how what unite the rebel group, and the question is not what they divide them. I attend. It was like kind of low profile facilitation of unity, and the question was what unite you, what you are, and then they have a lot of things to share, to talk about it, and so on. But when the question was what is the problem, it created another question, and then people they pointed to one another, and then people they are blaming each other, and so. But I think here the approach itself it helped in creating this kind of unity. So asking the right question, having the right place for people to meet, is not about having a fancy hotel as it used to be. If it is on the local level and the trees, and so it might produce a strong result than bringing the group in Sheraton and so. So all the experience of having people in a fancy hotel is per diem and the rest of it, and so it doesn't help in that. Besides the fact that also is expectation, what the people they expect, and so. So trying this from positive perspective, it will help in uniting the group. I understand there's some narrative about there's no need also for unity, but without it, I think the unity it reaches to the community level, it reaches to the family level. So without it, it's very difficult to achieve peace.
That's really interesting. I really like your comment about how it's not necessarily helpful to go to the Sheraton, because it produces a certain kind of, we might call it a bourgeois attitude, right? You go to your own room, you come to the conference room, and you go back, but other kinds of settings under the trees, I like how you describe this, that it produces this opportunity. And the way in which you ask these questions, maybe your interview procedure, having produced this reflection, might be helpful also as a mechanism for reflection on opportunity, so that they can learn how to walk before running. One last comment, which is about Bashir. Now you say after Bashir, what happens? And it's the question about the international community. And so much of what the work, we think of a peace process, we think of the situation is about the government and the rebels. But the government doesn't play a critical role here. I mean, there's the fragmentation of Sudan relative to the government too. What do we do, and this is, the we, the larger we, about, is there a process of engaging with Bashir now? Is it just to wait for him to die? What is the right way for the international community to engage the government of Sudan in the context of your findings?
Um, yeah, I think that's a very important question of how, like, engaging with the government. Uh, the the existing tragedy is that the government today, they have like a license or a permission to commit more atrocities under peace. Having the fact that the United States, for instance, lift sanction, it is an ideal to lift sanction, but it helps escalating a conflict from a different perspective. And the situation, the economic situation today in Sudan is worse than before. The war is worse than before. So, and that happened, and then this like at the level of we here in the United States. But if we move to Europe, we also find the same issue, that the European Union today, they became more closer to the government, and they have share funding goes to the to stop the refugees from coming to Europe and so. So this kind of engagement, it helped the government to turn a blind eye on the suffering of the people and so on and so on. But I think there's two ways here. One is to help the civil society to stand and to be part of the solution. And second, a government such as the Sudanese government, they all understand issues of pressure. When there's less pressure on the ICC, for instance, the International Criminal Court, when there's less pressure on the peace process and so, the government goes to commit more atrocities. But when there's a pressure on that, there's more attention and more focus on doing the right things.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'll just be very brief. I feel like I've lived with you in this for a while, and it's been a pleasure to see the progress here. I just want to underscore one of the points. One factor in judging a dissertation is originality and significance. And in this context, the resistance movements, they know about the divide and conquer, divide and rule strategy, but they don't know the as John mentioned, the tremendous efficiency and depth of the impact of that. And I recall speaking to one of the leaders of one of the resistance movements, somebody you interviewed, and we asked him, how many groups are there? And he took after about an hour, maybe 2 hours, trying to chart out all the group, he came up with 28. So I think they don't know. And your point that you just mentioned, I think, is very significant. The reflection of what has been going on has become, is a critical element in the conflict dynamics. In other words, the awareness of the pernicious tactics of the government itself becomes part of the dynamics. So there's kind of this fragmentation dynamic that then becomes part of it. So anyway, so I think it's more significant than you said. Just one point about this embeddedness. Do you think it becomes part of the kind of very microscopic interrelation within the groups? In other words, do the members of the groups gain a distrust as a result of this fragmentation? Do they become suspicious of each other as individuals? In other words, what's the element of trust or distrust that has that's emerged in this as a result of the fragmentation?
Yeah, in fact, yeah, absolutely. There's a big distrust among the the rebel leaders and some of the followers. Part of this, it has like a history of how the government also get involved on this. And one of them is the tactics of using satellite phone. So a group of the rebels, they have one satellite phone, and they are in government, in their territory, and the government has access to spy and to intercept the conversation. And so if there are three, they know that we are only three people that when we talk. And then the thing come out on the newspaper and the thing come out, and so that create kind of mistrust, like everybody thinks that the other
You
one.
think that one thinks that the other is being spied upon?
Yeah, it's spied upon, and then it creates that kind of tension, and then they break away. And this happened like in so many different times, to the extent that some of them they say we are not going to be part of the conversation, and when they are not there, the issue happens, and then they ask how. So that create kind of mistrust between the group. Other issues, the issue of signing peace agreement. Whomever decide to go to sign a peace agreement, they also think that he's part of the government or has long history of being part of the government, and he was planted inside the group as a spy.
Oh, they think he was planted. They
Yeah.
actually think this was pre-cooked. This was
Pre-cooked.
already part of the strategy.
Yeah, and it created a kind of violence. It went to a deadly violence between those who sign agreement and those who are not signing agreement. But they didn't know that, later they know that the government has a strong hand on this. So it created a kind of mistrust and so on. In addition to that, it's not only limited to the groups. It also goes to the supporters. And supporters can be like ordinary people as refugees or IDPs and so on. And whomever categorized as a spy, when he sign agreement and he travel to Darfur and so, he can't get like any kind of appreciation or reception or so. So that's why maybe about 80% of the rebel leaders who sign agreements, they live in Khartoum.
They live in Khartoum.
Yeah, they can't even go back to because they don't have like constituents there, they don't have supporter there and so.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have time for questions, and let me just recognize that part of your contribution to SCAR is reflected in, you have so many friends here, and you have faculty here, and you have students here, and you have members, I know, from the Washington, D.C. peace-building community, including the United States Institute of Peace represented here. So this is an indication, of course, of your contribution and, of course, affection. So I also suspect that they're here to keep the committee honest, that we don't mess up, and I hope we pass that test. So let me just open it up to the floor here.
Adeeb, excellent presentation. I had two questions, and it had to do with your recommendations, and I'm curious to know how do you envision it. The first one has to do with the legitimacy of actors that are involved in fragmentation, I'm assuming. What do you mean by the legitimacy? Is it by the people that are within the peace process, or is it from the actors that are actually involved with dealing with the rebel groups? My second question is, you have started an NGO within Africa that is in different countries. How do you envision your NGO, if at all, to build that legitimacy for peace in order to, facilitate the dialogue, if at all?
Yeah, okay, so the first part of the question about legitimacy is more a recommendation for the mediators and facilitators and people that they get involved in the conflict resolution in the Darfur case. Quite often they don't understand the local culture, and in many cases they bring the wrong people on the table, that they don't gain legitimacy within the community there, and they get like a lot of support, and there's no lack of such group or such individuals that they are famous in the international community, or within individuals that they have connection with the international community, and then they have been marketed as the leaders of the community. They sign agreement, and it is one of those who have been remain in Khartoum. They have never even visited the region. So there's so many cases of people that they were promoted by the international community and so as leaders. And then they sign peace agreement, and when they reach, they came to understand that it's just like a recognition outside in. They don't have like a recognition inside out, like a recognition from inside Sudan or inside Darfur to the outside world, but they have the other way around. And it couldn't work, and it can work. The second part of your question about the organization, the main focus on this is peace education, and is to plan peace on the mind of the people before doing other things. That's why the focus is on teaching people how to live together, how to respect one another, and so in conflict zone. And at the beginning of my presentation, I was saying that if I'm to tell my story to a 17 years old kid or a 10 years old in Darfur, they can't believe it. They can't believe me. They think that I'm talking about a different area, about a different country. Reason being because they have never witnessed a peaceful situation. That is not only limited to the Darfur or the Sudanese case. If we look around Colombia, there's a lot of people that they have never witnessed peace. If we look in Israel, there's so many people for the past 60 years they have never seen in South Sudan and so. So in such kind of community, there's a fundamental need, in my opinion, to remind them about the ordinary life before the conflict, how people they used to live together, how they respect one another, the kind of the collaboration, what life means before the conflict. And that's the basic thing that my colleague Sharon, Dr. Sherry and Miranda, they are present here. We're working together in order to build these ideas and to build and to share this with other people, and that even including here on issues of peace education and so on.
Jackie?
Yeah, so thank you, Adeeb. It's really exciting to see this, to see you come to this point. And I came late to the game, but I really appreciate the efforts of all of those that have supported you to get here. When you were talking, I was jotting down a couple of things, and it went back to the early slide about whether it's the conflict is about greed and grievance, or whether it's political issues or identity issues. And it strikes me that something else you said, that 80% of the people that signed the agreement, that resulted in fragmentation. So in terms of the question of whether it's that fragmentation is a result of an identity-based issue, it struck me that perhaps the identity is of being a rebel, and that if you sign an agreement, then you no longer have that identity of being a rebel. Now, what are you? You're pro-government, like you said, or you're a spy, or something along those lines. So, did it come out in your research or any of your interviews that there is an opportunity, perhaps, for reframing that identity? That once one signs an agreement, that one becomes, a pro-Darfurian peace builder, or pro-democracy, or pro-federal, or that there's some other identity that is positive to negate this potential for no longer being a rebel, and therefore you've lost that identity, and then you're just in this negative space. Does that make sense as a question? Just really asking if anything came up in your research or your interviews about that.
Yeah, I think it's an important question, and it depends on the action of the rebel group, what they will say and what they will do after signing an agreement, whether they are going to touch upon the basic and fundamental issues that they raise weapon for or not, and whether they are going to talk about the laws and the regulations that restrict, for instance, humanitarian aid to reach to the point or not. So if they start talking about that, then people, they can view them, I mean other actors, they can view them different as peacemakers or so. But if they came and they live in Khartoum without talking about at least the Humanitarian Act of 2006, 2012, if they can't even talk about that, then people, they have no, I mean some actors, they cannot say, on my research, yes, in fact, they went further to talk about this. In 2010, 2011, Scott Gratian, the special envoy for the US, Darfur, he was trying to create a unity. And so he created, and then there's some people that accept the invitation and they became part of it. So that group, they call them SLA Gratian. Because of that kind of thing. So it depends on their behavior and attitude and the way they see things and issues. That is according to what I feel from my research.
Okay, my name is Nasruddin Abdelbari, and I am a doctoral student myself at Georgetown University. Thank you, Adeeb, for this excellent presentation on such an important topic that nobody has written on, as far as I know. And I think it will help a lot with the efforts to achieve peace in Darfur and to address the root causes of the conflict. I have three questions. One has to do with the models of actually finding a resolution for the problem in Darfur. And you, I think, argue that federalism is the best solution. And I'm just wondering if you think that by the passage of time, if federalism is not actually recognized constitutionally in Sudan, and it doesn't seem that it will be recognized anytime soon. According to what I see now, there's more actually centralization in Sudan. In 2005, we have witnessed a highly decentralization in Sudan because of the peace agreement, but now there is now some tendency to centralization. So it doesn't seem that there will be federalism. Do you think that it will be possible for the people of Darfur at some point to think of secession, especially that that the history of South Sudan shows that secession was not on the table in 1955 when they actually started fighting. They were asking for federalism, and the political organizations in Khartoum were against federalism. And you, as you know, wars actually do not only create tragedies and human rights violations, they also create ideas. Sometimes bad ideas, sometimes good ideas. So do you think that secession will be on the table at some point in the future? I don't see that there is a solution right now, not in 5 years, not in 10 years. What do you think? That is my first question. If I can ask more than one question.
Sure. Maybe one at a time.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right.
Just for me to remember.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned an important point about conflict and how it helped changing dynamics and so. Part of what happened in South Sudan in 1956 or 1955, when they started fighting, yes, that was the call. And 1978, when the Addis Ababa was signed, there's kind of recognition for that. But the current, I mean, the recent conflict of the SPLM, SPLA Garang, his vision was one united Sudan. One of the things that happened in 1991 when the fragmentation happened between Garang and Machar, he renamed the movement, and he said South Sudan Independence Movement. So it was clear that it shifted his idea and the agenda from fighting for the whole Sudan just to fight for the independence of Sudan, of South Sudan. And that happened, unfortunately, lately it happened and occurred, and the country has been divided and so on. In the situation of Darfur, although Darfur was an independent country and it became part of Sudan within like 100 years, it is very difficult to achieve separation from Sudan. I pointed at some point about the complexity of separation in Sudan, ethnic complexity. There's so many things that it might not happen. And then the fresh example of South Sudan, what happened after? Like after the independence or after the separation of South Sudan, the tragedy, it became even worse than the war before. So, and to gain independence, it needs like a lot of international support, and I don't think the international community is ready for secession of Darfur. So that is one. Second, on the issue of the federalism, is not about, I believe it's about the people. If there is a people having a clear idea that they market it, that they convince their supporters, that could be happen. But if it is a slogan, that is difficult to achieve. In Sudan, part of the challenge that the rebel groups, they don't focus on other issues, political issues, diplomatical issues, and so on. They only focus on military operation. And once they reach the point, they can't get the other means in order to achieve I am optimistic that this federalism, it could happen.
Okay. My second question has to do with counter-insurgency, or specifically the counter-insurgency strategy that you spoke about. And I would like just to ask if you think that this counter-insurgency strategy has to do with the broader identity question in Sudan, or identity politics in Sudan, because you can say that not all the Janjaweed are from specific ethnic groups, but they are dominantly from specific ethnic groups that are known as Arab tribes in Darfur, and that is a fact. And if you look at the leadership of this Janjaweed militia or force right now, the leadership is also dominantly from, or maybe 99%, I would say, from specific ethnic groups that can be actually classified as part of the ruling identity in Sudan, so to speak. So what do you think? Do you think it has to do, and you can also think of the other organizations that are fighting the government, they are dominantly from specific ethnic groups. Maybe 95% they are classified, or they classify themselves, or identify themselves as African groups, or as Black African groups. So that is a question that I just had in mind, if you can address it.
Yeah, I think it's an important question in the sense that how it helped with the issue of the fragmentation itself. So the rebel movement, when it started, it was not Sudan Liberation Movement. It was Darfur Liberation Front. And the government managed to put this Janjaweed, as you said, like from a 13, or many of them, they're from a certain ethnic group, in order to counter this group. And the storyline by then was, if you Arab didn't go and fight with us, the government, then this liberation is not about anything but Arab not, there's no present for Arab in Darfur. That's why the government managed to mobilize many of the Arab groups and became the part of the government and so. But this was not only the strategy has not only been used in Darfur. When the fighting was in South Sudan, they used a different, it's the same kind of strategy, Halim. And it's also a part of the Syria and the Arab group. And then for the other people from South Sudan, they call them the friend forces. That is the people from South Sudan as an African. So it is a strategy in order to keep these people fighting among themselves. And it has been so clear from the Sudanese narrative where the central government or the elites in the north, they don't care. And the narrative was kill the slave by the slave, whereby all Darfurian are slaves and let them kill themselves if they are Arab or if they are not Arab and so. So the counterinsurgency as a tribe counterinsurgency is so dangerous because at the end it creates like tension. The government cannot be in Sudan for like forever. A time that this government will be out of power, but the people of Darfur will remain. And so how can you deal with such kind of fragmentation? So, the second part of the question about the rapid support forces, whether they are also, many of them are from the Arab ethnic group, is absolutely true. The leaders are from there, but the actual reality is there's so many people that are not even from Darfur. And on the recent arrest of the January leader Musihran, those who went to arrest him, many of them they are not even from Darfur. I interviewed one of the rebel leaders and I asked him about his opinion there. And then he said, I'm going to be from Genjoboro. And I asked him, what is Genjoboro? And he said, he was referring to like a group from the rebel group, then they joined the January. So that is create like another dynamic, complexity on the, for the conflict. So to make it short, the tribal counterinsurgency is so dangerous in a tribal society.
Thank you. And my last question is actually about the fragmentation of the rebel movements. And when we look at actually all, maybe or most of the rebel movements in Africa or elsewhere, you would always find that there are disagreements and you find there are more than one group or movements fighting the central government. And that is something maybe inherent in any political movement in a society where you have tribal or ethnic polarization. I don't think that is an issue in and of itself, and we have seen that also in South Sudan. Do you think, in your opinion, that this can actually be seen as one of the aspects of lack of vision among the Darfuri rebel leaders? Because if there is a strong vision, you wouldn't have 200 rebel movements. You can have 5, you can have 7, you can have 10, but you cannot have 200. Do you think that there is a lack of vision that caused this unusual fragmentation? That is one. And there is another reason that one can also think of, which is a lack of charismatic leadership. In South Sudan, just to make a comparison, we also saw that there were a lot of rebel movements, but there were 3 charismatic leaders that were the center of all the rebel movements. And there was one charismatic leader that was the center of all the movements. Do you think that we don't find that in Darfur? And is that actually a reason that you can rely on to analyze or to say that that is why there is this unusual fragmentation or division in Darfur?
Yeah, definitely it is unusual, and there's a lot of things that it's supposed to cause unity in within the Darfurian rebel groups. The suffering of the people, it might one of the strongest things that people can change their mind of this kind of disunity, and so unfortunately it wasn't the case. The fighting together, the ICC, and so there's a lot of things that it's supposed to bring the rebel group together, but unfortunately, it doesn't happen. I think also you answer like part of the question, the lack of vision, and then the issue of the charismatic leader, and part of my analysis on the issue of perception, the attitude, how one group looked at the other group when they categorize, oh, this is not even from Darfur, this is from Chad, and so. So lack of charismatic leaders, as you pointed out, is one of the things, and the other thing is the lack of vision. That definitely is unusual. In South Sudan, for like 21 years of fighting, these 5 groups, that including the friend forces, the government called them, the Sudanese government force called them.
Thank you very much for your excellent questions. And at this point, we do have a time constraint here, so I'm going to have to cut this off now. But now is the work of our committee. I think the easiest thing is for us 3 to go to another room, and we're going to talk it out, and then we'll come back, and I invite you, to enjoy the refreshments and relax, and we'll be back in a little while. Okay? Thank you very much.